For drivers on the West Coast, gasoline is not just another purchase. It is part of the cost of getting to work, taking children to school, running errands, moving goods, and keeping a household running. In California, that cost is already far above the national average. On May 25, 2026, AA listed California's average regular gasoline price at $6.116 per gallon. The national average was $4.507 per gallon. On that day, California drivers were paying about $1.61 more per gallon than the U.S. average. The pump price is the visible part of the story. Behind it is a fuel system that is changing. California is losing refinery capacity. Two major refinery actions are now central to the West Coast fuel market: Phillips 66's Los Angeles area refinery and Valero's Benicia refinery. Phillips 66 announced on October 16, 2024, that it planned to cease operations at its Los Angeles area refinery in the fourth quarter of 2025. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the refinery's Wilmington facility has a capacity of 139,000 barrels per day. Valero announced on April 16, 2025, that its California subsidiary had notified the California Energy Commission of its intent to idle, restructure, or cease refining operations at the Benicia refinery by the end of April 2026. EIA cited Benicia's capacity at 145,000 barrels per day. Together, EI said those two planned closures represent 17% of California refinery capacity and 11% of West Coast, or PADD 5, refinery capacity. Nationally, they represent less than 2% of U.S. refining capacity. That difference matters. A refinery closure can look small on a national chart and still be large inside a regional fuel market. Gasoline is felt locally before it is felt nationally. Supply conditions in California are not the same as supply conditions on the Gulf Coast. And the West Coast fuel system is more isolated than many drivers may realize. EI has said California has higher gasoline prices partly because the West Coast lacks strong logistical connections to the Gulf Coast and other major U.S. refining centers. Put simply, California cannot easily replace lost fuel supply with gasoline from other parts of the country. That is how refinery capacity becomes a household cost issue. When refining capacity falls in a region with limited connections, the fuel system has fewer options. Replacement fuel may have to come from imports. Those imports can take longer to reach the market than fuel moved through nearby refining and distribution networks. EI said replacement fuel is more likely to come from overseas, including gasoline and jet fuel from Asia. It also warned that Pacific Ocean shipments take longer to respond to market demand, which can increase the risk of temporary price spikes or price volatility during shortfalls. That does not mean higher gasoline prices are guaranteed every day or every month. The research does not support that. EIA's point is more measured. Reduced refinery capacity may increase West Coast price volatility risk. For households, volatility still matters. A family does not budget for regional supply volatility. It budgets for gallons of gasoline. A commuter does not calculate refinery capacity. They look at the pump total. A small business does not experience PAD 5 capacity as an abstract number. It experiences transportation costs, delivery costs, and the monthly pressure of keeping vehicles on the road. The West Coast refinery story is also a labor story. When Phillips 66 announced the Los Angeles area closure, the company said the refinery had about 600 employees and 300 contractors. Reuters later reported that Phillips 66 would lay off 277 workers as operations wound down, including 122 in April 2026 and 155 in an earlier notice. That is the local side of a regional energy shift. A refinery is not only a supply asset. It is also a workplace. When operations wind down, the effects can reach households through jobs, income stability, and communities connected to industrial activity. Phillips 66 CEO Mark Lashier said in the company's October 2024 announcement, "We understand this decision has an impact on our employees, contractors, and the broader community." That statement reflects an important part of the story. The same decision that affects fuel supply can also affect workers who depend on the facility for income. Valero's Benicia decision added another major piece. On April 16, 2025, Valero announced that it had notified the California Energy Commission of its intent to idle, restructure, or cease refining operations at Benicia by the end of April 2026. The company also recorded a combined pre-tax impairment charge of $1.1 billion for the Benicia and Wilmington refineries. Valero CEO Lane Riggs said, "We understand the impact that this may have on our employees, business partners, and community." In January 2026, Valero said it would proceed with phased idling at Benicia. Processing units were expected to begin idling in February. The company said it would continue producing gasoline while inventories were worked down, and expected most refining process units to be idled by April. Valero also said it was continuing to evaluate strategic options and planning additional gasoline imports to the Bay Area. That is another sign of a changing system. If local refining capacity falls, the replacement system becomes more important. Imports, inventories, shipping timing, and regulatory planning all carry more weight. The price at the pump becomes tied not only to crude oil prices, but also to whether the regional fuel system can replace lost supply smoothly. EIA's July 2025 analysis made this point directly. It said the Phillips 66 and Valero refinery closures could increase West Coast fuel price volatility. EIA also said West Coast gasoline imports were increasing compared with previous years because of lower West Coast refinery capacity. In late May 2025, EIA said West Coast gasoline imports rose above 210,000 barrels per day on a 4-week average basis, setting a record at that time. And that number matters because it shows the region was already relying more heavily on imported gasoline. Imports can help replace lost supply, but they also create a different kind of dependence. Fuel has to travel farther. The system has to respond across ocean routes. When demand changes or supply is disrupted, replacement barrels may not arrive as quickly as local production could. This is where the hidden system behind gasoline becomes clearer. Gasoline is not simply produced and sold. It moves through crude supply, refinery capacity, blending requirements, terminals, inventories, shipping routes, and retail stations. In California, there is another layer, CARBOB, a California-specific gasoline blend stock. EIA said CARBOB can only be manufactured by properly equipped refineries. That limits the number of possible replacement suppliers. For ordinary drivers, that technical detail only becomes visible when the price changes. But inside the fuel market, it matters because not every refinery can make the exact fuel California requires. That makes the replacement supply pool smaller. The chain is straightforward, refinery capacity declines. The region becomes more dependent on imports and inventories. Replacement fuel may take longer to arrive. Price volatility risk increases. Drivers face the possibility of more pump price pressure. The same chain can extend beyond private drivers. Arizona and Nevada may also be affected because EIA said both states receive fuel shipments from California refiners and are likely to be affected by reduced regional supply. This makes the issue broader than one city or one company facility. It is a regional supply story. For households in those states, the connection may not be obvious. A refinery closure in California can seem distant. But when a region shares fuel supply networks, a change in one part of the system can affect prices elsewhere. That is why this belongs in a cost of living discussion. Gasoline is not optional for many households. It affects commuting, school transportation, errands, medical appointments, and small business operations. Higher fuel costs reduce the room families have for other expenses. Even when the increase is regional, the household effect is real. The story also has to be handled carefully. The available research does not show that refinery closures alone explain every gasoline price movement. Gas prices are affected by many forces, including crude oil prices. EIA specifically said lower crude oil prices in 2026 could counteract some near-term effects from the capacity closures. So the accurate conclusion is not that closures guarantee higher prices. The accurate conclusion is that reduced refinery capacity is putting pressure on a regional fuel system that already has high prices and limited replacement options. That distinction matters. A serious economic story does not need exaggeration. The verified numbers are already significant. West Coast gasoline prices averaged $5.61 per gallon on May 18, 2026, according to EIA. That was up 31% from a year earlier, or $1.32 per gallon. California's average regular gasoline price was $6.116 per gallon on May 25, 2026, according to AA. The national average was $4.507 per gallon. The two California refinery closures represent 17% of California refinery capacity. According to EIA, Phillips 66's Los Angeles area refinery had about 600 employees and 300 contractors when the closure was announced. Reuters reported 277 layoffs tied to the refinery wind-down. Valero's Benicia refinery was expected to have most refining process units idled by April 2026. Together, these facts describe a fuel system in transition. They also explain why drivers may feel pressure without following refinery news. A driver sees the final price, but that price reflects the system behind it. When the system loses capacity, relies more on imports, and has limited pipeline connections to other U.S. refining hubs, the margin for error becomes smaller. California regulators are also part of the current status. On October 14, 2024, Governor Gavin Newsom signed ABX 2-1, giving the California Energy Commission authority to develop minimum refined fuel inventory requirements. The CEC says ABX 2-1 allows it to assess and potentially develop resupply and minimum inventory requirements to reduce shortages and price spikes. Reuters reported in July 2025 that the California Energy Commission said it was engaging with market players on continued operation of in-state refineries. That is the government view. Regulators are looking at inventory and resupply planning as tools to reduce shortages and price spikes. The company view is different but connected. Phillips 66 said it would work with California to supply fuel markets and meet ongoing consumer demand after closing the Los Angeles area refinery. Valero said it expected to import additional gasoline volumes to the Bay Area in the near term. The consumer view is the pump price. AIA's May 25, 2026 data showed California drivers paying far more than the national average for regular gasoline. EIA's May 18, 2026 data showed West Coast gasoline prices sharply higher than 1 year earlier. Each viewpoint describes the same system from a different position. Companies are managing assets and operations. Regulators are focused on inventories, resupply, and price spikes. EIA is measuring capacity, imports, and regional price risk. Consumers are paying for fuel. The household sits at the end of that chain. That is why a refinery closure can become a grocery budget or rent budget issue, even when it begins as an energy market event. When gasoline costs more, the money has to come from somewhere else in the household budget. For many middle-class families, that means less flexibility across food, utilities, insurance, savings, or debt payments. The situation remains unresolved. As of January 2026, Valero said it was proceeding with phased idling at Benicia and evaluating strategic options. As of February 2026, Phillips 66 had layoffs tied to the Los Angeles area refinery wind-down. As of May 2026, AI reported that West Coast gasoline imports continued to increase compared with prior years because of lower West Coast refinery capacity. West Coast gasoline prices were up 31% year-over-year on May 18th. What remains uncertain is the exact pump price effect from the closures. EIA has identified the risk of higher volatility. It has also noted that lower crude oil prices could offset some near-term effect. The most accurate story is not a guaranteed price spike. It is a story about reduced regional capacity and greater exposure to supply disruptions, imports, and timing. For drivers, that exposure may still be costly. A fuel system with less local refining capacity and more import dependence can become more sensitive to disruptions. A region that already has high gasoline prices has less room for household budgets to absorb new pressure. Communities around refineries can face job impacts at the same time consumers face fuel price pressure. This is where the West Coast fuel market now stands. Two major refinery actions are changing California's fuel system. EA says those refineries represent 17% of California refinery capacity. The West Coast remains relatively isolated from other U.S. refining hubs. California uses a specialized gasoline blend stock that limits replacement suppliers. Imports are becoming more important. Workers are affected by refinery wind downs. Drivers are already paying high prices compared with the national average. The story is not about one company alone. It is not only about one refinery gate. It is about how energy infrastructure, regional supply, import dependence, regulation, company decisions, and household budgets connect. At the beginning of the chain are refinery closures and capacity changes. In the middle are inventories, imports, shipping routes, and regional fuel markets. At the end are drivers, workers, families, small businesses, and communities. That is why West Coast refinery closures have become more than an industry story. They are becoming a gas price risk that ordinary Americans can feel at the pump.